Welcome everyone to this discussion about the Indo-Pacific. I'm going to put our first slide up here. So we're going to do this in the context of these maps and this geographic relationship. I like this cartographic angle to think about it. So this question of these four countries, India, Australia, the US, and Japan, which as you can see makes a quadrilateral. So, 2007, there's discussion of a quad relationship, which kind of died, seemed to pick up again. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific is something that is in the discussions these days in a variety of contexts around trade and geopolitics and the relationships to the rest of the world. So we'd like to start first with this framing, and then we're going to kind of go into pieces of this. And so I'm actually going to first ask Philippe if you could talk a little bit about the term Indo-Pacific and how that relates to this
the
topic.
other day I read something about the Indo-Pacific, and I read a definition from an Indian strategist, I think. He said Indo-Pacific is first the union of Indian geography and Asian Pacific geography. So this sounds very geographic, right? At the same time, the four countries which are mentioned there, Japan, starting with Japan, India, Australia, and the US, they don't think of Indo-Pacific as of a geographic term. The geographic term, which is going to be left out now more and more in strategic discussions, is the Asia-Pacific. So Indo-Pacific is a strategic term. It's about exerting power, about exerting influence, about reacting to other expansionist powers in the region, to put it very generally. It has been mentioned the first time by a naval officer, Indian naval officer in the 90s, but it has been taken up by the Japanese Prime Minister Abe during his first term as a strategic term. So there is an intention behind the Indo-Pacific concept. And it's all about this intention, what we are going to discuss here. So much for me right now.
Daniel, so the elephant in the room here is China's not part of this relationship. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what do you think these countries want out of this relationship, and is this a counterbalance to kind of the Sino-centric view of the world, or how do you think that is to be interpreted?
I give you a typically diplomatic answer to that. Is the Indo-Pacific directed against China? Yes or no?
Okay, very good.
Yes, in the sense that there is a feeling there is growing Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea, but also in other areas. We'll talk about more later on. No, in the sense that everybody realized the elephant is there. The elephant is already quite developed. It's there. They will, short of some extremist thinking, have to find a way to cope with China.
And actually, Phil, back to you on this question. Obviously there's been lots of changes in the U.S., not for the better. I'll expose my bias a little bit. But, and as a consequence, I think that's, at least from my reading and just as background, I lived in Japan for a very long time and speak Japanese and read Japanese press. And I think that the Japanese seem to be trying to gauge, what their interaction should be with the U.S. But in, say, this relationship, do you see each of these countries working kind of independently but coordinated, or do you see it more that the Japanese are going to try to fall into line with the Americans, and then it's more of a the U.S. is kind of pushing things from behind? I know it's a hard thing to...
I have no U.S. bias.
Okay.
I just say what I see.
Yeah.
I think the sort of driving force in this quadrilateral network or relationship is probably Japan with regard to the Indo-Pacific term. So it seems to me, once you go into the papers and try to understand what is in it, it seems to me that Japan has a clear vision and a clear understanding and a clear intention behind the term of Indo-Pacific. Australia, you will tell us later, Daniel. At the US, and here comes in my non-biased view of the US, it's purely objective, descriptive. They have sent out mixed signals. Some signals say, yes, we are in the Pacific, we are there to stay. So the Indo-Pacific is important for us because of our opposition to Chinese expansion. On the other hand, they cancel the military maneuvers in Korea, giving a signal that they are going to withdraw out of the area. At the same time, they changed the name of the Pacific Command into Indo-Pacific Command. That's the one in Hawaii. So what I take from all the most recent moves coming from the United States is that at least we can say what they do on the affirmative side is troubling, is confusing, and creates a new hallmark for the US that is you don't know on what you can count with them. That is a very difficult judgment on the US policy in the region.
So there's this increased uncertainty that builds into
Yes.
the situation. Now, one question, maybe I'll direct it first to you, Daniel, that always comes up is you have this recent motivation, recent in the last years where Abe has been prime minister, where the Japanese are focused on improving their military prowess. So they're trying to rescind the Article 9 in their constitution that would allow them to be involved in more offensive military maneuvers. And historically, the U.S. military presence has kind of created this underlying stability. Do you see that with the military ambitions of the Chinese, maybe even the Indians? Do you see that as an issue in the context of this Indo-Pacific relationship?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's by far the largest arms race going on at this time, as we know, is in that larger area. The Asia-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific, whatever you call it, that's where today and in the years to come, probably the whole of the 21st century, a big arms race is on. And that, as Philippe already said, of course, we always had Pax Americana in the Asia-Pacific, but that has become a little bit less certain lately. Trump administration, but already before, especially looking from Australia, one always wondered what these pivot to Asia really meant in dollars and cents, in military hardware. Military hardware is still there, but the rest of it is still very fuzzy. Thus, yes, the Quad very definitely has an underlying military reason, which then in turn could be a problem for India. But it's just one of the complexities of the area.
And then, Philip, for you, before we start diving into some of this, there's always a question of rules. And the rules that the U.S. is putting forward are not necessarily the same as what you might come from a country like India. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah. What is much more relevant for the concept of Indo-Pacific? It's a concept, it's a 3G concept. And a recurring term in that context is the term of rules-based order. Now, the US, the defense minister Mattis recently said they use that. They use rules-based order with one meaning. The Indians speak of rules-based order, but they have another understanding of rules-based. What they all have in mind when they say it's what we want is a rules-based order in the region, the strategic intention of this term is it's directed against China, because what they say is China is expanding militarily, economically, without respect for any rules. Speaking of public international law rules, maritime law rules, other rules. Now, it seems as if the Americans and Indians would, they say the same, but do they mean the same? No, they don't mean the same. When the Americans say we want a rules-based order in the region, they say it's like in a fish, an advertisement. We are here to stay first, and we are not here to dominate. We are here to cooperate. But it's always according within the U.S. terms of cooperation. So
it's not really a negotiation, always.
Yeah, that's the modern way of speaking of hegemony. The Indians have a completely different understanding of rules-based. They refer, when the Indians speak of rules-based order, for them rules-based is a reference to the rule of law state. That's the British legacy. They're very proud. And when they say rules-based, they think of rule of law, and they think of rule of law as British legacy, and the other British legacy is democracy. And they say we are a law-abiding country in principle, and we are a democracy. And whenever we use that as an intention behind this treaty concept, it's because we want to confront the Chinese, who are not democratic, who have no rule of law tradition, and who are dangerous. But they don't say so. They hide between the word rules-based order. The Indians mean something else than the Americans, but they hide behind that because the Indians refuse to say, yes, it's against China. They say, no, it's not against China, but of course it's against China.
And how does Australia fit into this context? Because I sometimes wonder where they sit on the different sides of these debates, because they're kind of in the middle.
They are, of course, always compared to the two elephants in Asia Pacific, India and China. They're a small country. They're not really a small country. They're very rich in resources, space resources, etc. And they are a fantastic or a fascinating example of a country that clearly started out as a European outpost, British outpost, has become by immigration first European, a European outpost, contrary to New Zealand. Australia is very European, less British, and now becomes very quickly also an Asian country. When you walk around in Sydney or you sit in a coffee in Sydney, you very clearly see that this is becoming a truly Asian Pacific country. So their relationship is far more ambiguous to China. They know perfectly well that they will absolutely have a relatively well-functioning relationship with China. At the same time, what Philippe called the rule of law and democracy is, of course, also for India, is also very important for Australia. So they're in a very difficult spot there to transit from a European country to a local country without foregoing some of the self-evident truth that is on the base of the whole Australian understanding of themselves.
Actually, with that as a segue, I'd like to transition now into the ASEAN question, or ASEAN centrality. And so maybe we'll come back to you, Daniel, if you want to talk a little bit about how does ASEAN fit into this picture.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know that truly Asia thing? I think it was Malaysia who started. Malaysia, truly Asia, you know the thing. That's what the ASEAN countries think of themselves, not just Malaysia. ASEAN, we are truly Asia, we're the soul and the heart of Asia. Call it correct or not, but if you look at particular spots, for example, Singapore, you know what they mean. Big Chinese influence, but also, of course, quite an important Malay influence, and then the Indian curry to make this whole thing work. And as we all know, it works relatively well. So the ASEAN understands itself as being in the middle, which, Jeff, if I may, is incidentally one of the reasons why Indo-Pacific makes them a little hesitate. They say the word Asia is not even in it. How can it be Asia? This is, of course, purely formal, but it plays a role in the sense that the ASEAN countries are dead serious about being in the middle. They're dead serious about saying ASEAN, and I'm not going to, come with all these abbreviations, but they think they start, then the extension of them, of ASEAN, inviting other countries. It's called ASEAN plus plus plus. But whatever it's called, what they mean is that the structure has to be based in the middle of Asia, and that is in the ASEAN, fully knowing well that despite the fact that they're a market of over half a billion people and consumers, that they are not as large, not as rich, not as important as China is, and they're certainly not as large and as democratic also as India is.
But Philippe, if you look at the map, when we start bringing ASEAN into the picture, it starts pulling the center of this quadrilateral closer to India. And I'm just curious how you perceive that. Is that just an artifact of geography, or does that really impact policy and negotiations?
We can get a better understanding of India's role and ASEAN countries' role in the concept of Indo-Pacific, if you remember, and introduce with that the complete term. They do not talk just about Indo-Pacific, they speak about free and open Indo-Pacific. There it becomes almost ideological. There, this term, free and open Indo-Pacific, is a clear indication of what they mean. And it's important for the ASEAN countries. Free and open, combined with the term of rules-based order, is a very clear reference to maritime law rules. Free and open means everybody can travel through the region without hindrances and obstacles. And this is, of course, fundamentally opposed to the Chinese expansion in South China Sea, for example. And South China Sea is in the middle of the ASEAN countries. So they have a very important, a dramatic interest to keep their area open for trade lines, for military maneuvers also, for air routes and shipping lanes, which is being impeded by the Chinese expansion. So now, what about India? That was your question. Sorry, I always expanded. Because I like to speak about India. India means exactly that. India, we'll see that with the next map. India is confronted with the same problem, with the problem of let's keep the seas open and free. We don't see it on this map. Here you see the relevance of free and open Indo-Pacific seen from the ASEAN countries. On the next map, we will see that later, we'll see the relevance of this concept for the Indians. And here also you see the relevance for Japan. So the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific means no hegemonic aspirations of any power in the region. I mean, for India, the most important thing is the Indian Ocean. And that's where they feel uneasy, confronted with Chinese aspirations. So for India, the aspect free and open Indo-Pacific is the key element why they are interested in the Indo-Pacific. It's because they want to have a free and open Indian Ocean and free and open communication lines through the Strait of Malacca into ASEAN, into the ASEAN area.
And if I may I, Jeff, comment on that? The South China Sea, which of course is exactly that continuation, Strait of Malacca going to the South China Sea, is also free and open. South China Sea is of course very central also to the interests of almost all ASEAN countries. When I first became ambassador in Brunei, I had to look it up in the map. Brunei is really small, side accredited from Singapore.
Rich.
Rich, yes. But the point is that even tiny little Brunei has a claim to borders within the South China Sea, not just formal, but relatively important because of important resources on the sea ground or below the sea ground, has claims to China, where China has a tendency to think, come on, Brunei, these are all small countries. What do they want from us? Well, what they want, and this is something very central that Philippe has underlined a couple of times, they want full respect of their sovereignty. They want full respect for their frontier. Most of them were former colonies, and they're not about to be crushed by anybody, be it from abroad, from far abroad, from Europe in the past, or from up close in their new gained feeling that they're now independent, sovereign, and that they can govern themselves and their destinies.
But I think the question is this balance between economic and military power. So maybe you can comment a little bit on that, because Brunei's got a lot of economic power. And then you have the Singaporeans, but they're relying on the U.S., and they get mixed up with the Chinese and the Indians. So how does that impact this whole discussion?
You're absolutely, well, just very quickly, you're absolutely right. I mean, other than the formal side, there's of course the real side. And the real side is very clearly tilted in favor of the big ones, and especially of China. They try to find a middle way through. What they do not like, the ASEAN countries, sorry if I may just expand a little bit more on the ASEAN countries, what they do not like is that the mainland China plays on their Chinese sides. Give you just a very quick example. Former, very important Singaporean diplomat of Indian origin just criticized in a Singaporean official media, which cannot be done without the approval of the government, very vehemently China and its new assertiveness towards the Chinese diaspora. It's not really a diaspora any longer. These Chinese have been in these countries, be it in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and Singapore for a long time. He criticized that in very direct language, which is untypical for Singapore. The Chinese ambassador retorted also in very clear language. That's what they don't like. They like to trade, but they want to be taken serious, and they certainly don't want to be seen as an extension of mainland China.
Can you talk a little bit about, say, a country like Malaysia, which has both of these different components?
And Mr. Mahathir, as I think you're a well-informed audience, you know Mahathir, the new Malaysian Prime Minister, has just been in China, has been talking about this, what we call the Belt and Road Initiative projects, mainly Chinese-inspired and built projects in these countries, and has told the Chinese more or less to say, go away. At the same time, he has not really stopped many of these big projects, because Malaysia knows very well that they do need Chinese support, Chinese money, Chinese might. They're playing an interesting game between their economic interests, their strategic interests, and on the other hand, the very old conviction in the ASEAN that you cannot have outside powers coming too much or inserting too much in the determining of their own destiny.
But to what extent is that, and maybe Philip, this is a good question for you, if the if the Malaysians are telling the Chinese kind of step back, and you have this change in the U.S., does that mean India has more influence than they might otherwise have in this new, kind of rearrangement of alliances to some extent?
India has a strong tradition of not interfering with other countries, and a strong pacifist tradition. And that's what the Indians dislike in the military approach of the Americans, for example. The Americans are always straightforward. So we are here to stay. We have the fleet here, and we want to resist against Chinese expansionists. Against the Chinese who try to take the South China Sea as their own, sea as a lake. And that there's always this strong military component in the American rhetoric. That's something Indians hate. They fear that. But they have, out of principle, they have a strong interest in upholding the principle of free and open. And because they need that in Indian Ocean, as we will see later. And the same principle applies to the whole area of the ASEAN states. I see the ASEAN states as being in a dilemma. First, they must refuse the Chinese expansion in the South China Sea, because that is a complete and systematic violation of maritime law. It's hegemonic, and they are going to steal natural resources underneath. At the same time, these countries, they have all an old tradition of being hegemonic aspirations, I mean, from all times. So you remember, Vietnam has always been a neighbor of China who was always fearing, who was always scared by China, but they defeated them in a war some 30 years ago. That was humiliating for the Chinese. That will not happen again. But see, they're in a dilemma. They cannot accept the systematic violation of the law of sea and maritime rules. At the same time, they are afraid. And look how opportunistic they behave. They concede things to Chinese, political things, economic things. And they are also not, they are quite sensitive when it comes to economic aid, cooperation, development of infrastructure. And there it's where the Chinese money comes in, under the heading of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So the dilemma in which the ASEAN states find themselves is another problem than the problem in which India finds itself. We'll be speaking about India with the next map, but this is one of the differences. They all speak of free and open Indo-Pacific, but they mean different things. That's why it's less than a concept, it's an idea. It's not yet a concept, and not even and certainly not an alliance. Probably the Americans would and the Japanese would dream of creating an alliance under the heading of Indo-Pacific. This is far away, because interests are too
misaligned.
Yes. Yeah.
But actually, with the TransPacific Partnership kind of becoming hindered by the fact of the current U.S. administration pulling out, you do have another 11
by the current government.
Right. You've got you do have some of the other Asian countries trying to pick that back up. You have the Japanese that are heavily investing in ASEAN, although it tends to be directed more towards Thailand, Myanmar, Burma, and Singapore. So you start getting, I always find it interesting, some of these relationships end up aligning with the, call them biases, for lack of a better term, around where they're focusing. Do you see, maybe start with you, Daniel, do you see an impact on the military, the geopolitical situation as a consequence of kind of the economic focus, or are those two completely separate?
Oh, they're not separate at all. Absolutely, they go in tandem. And you mentioned at the very beginning that Japan was in its own armament process, you can call it like this, overcoming this, what they consider, at least the present government, an anormal situation for a large economic power such as Japan. So they're very much allied, and I think the ASEAN countries, Indonesia has some military might, but it's not that impressive in the regional context. Singapore is very small, but has quite impressive military might for such a small country. But they know that they can never compare and can never compete with China. So whatever comes from Japan, whatever comes from India, is very much welcome in the area of military might. Even more welcome, of course, they rely still very much on American military might. But if it's not American, to a certain extent, as I think we try to make clear, so much the better.
Okay,
I think this,
sorry, go ahead.
A strategic problem we have in the region is that the mightiest power, so to say, militarily and economically, is the United States. Now you ask, is that a growing military might, or is it receding? That's the problem. we do not know. So
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't even know the answer to that question, and I'm an American.
The US has become unpredictable.
Yes.
To be unpredictable in a strategic setting is bad for the country itself and for the others too. So that's what they all fear most is the unpredictability of the United States. They don't know, are they coming or are they pulling out? And they don't know. Day by day, they ask themselves this question. And this is relevant for the future of the area. Will there be the mightiest powers possible in the region? They have renamed the command in Hawaii. It's Indo-Pacific, but whether they will have an Indo-Pacific strategic outreach, we don't know. They change every day.
Good point. Well, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to
unbiased.
Unbiased. Actually, and I do want to point out one thing before we shift to the next map. One of the things that came up in some of the analysis that I had been doing before when I was living in Japan is the big tsunami that was devastating in Thailand really disrupted the global supply chains in a way that a lot of us who are kind of look at this for a long time didn't entirely anticipate. So there's that interconnectivity is also something that I think is underappreciated. Is another point. Okay, let's move to now more of our Indo-centric picture, and maybe Philippe, you can talk about the how this looks if we bring in the question of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and the interaction with the Central Asian countries as well as China.
Yeah, the big thing in the region, on the continent, is the relationship between the two giants. We have two giants, and India is still dreaming of overtaking China population-wise in 10, 15 years and economically in 20 years, which might be a dream, but still that's what they seem to think about. There's an important story behind this relationship. The Chinese, Nehru was dreaming, when he started in 1947, he was dreaming of a strong alliance of two underdeveloped countries, as they called themselves then, freshly decolonized in the case of India. He was dreaming of a strong alliance between the two in order to develop and to take more importance in world affairs. And that was very soon disappointed because China took another development with the communist revolution and all that. And don't forget that the 3,000 odd kilometers frontier line between China and India is not recognized.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's in the Himalayan, where you don't have so many people who can fight, but from time to time they do. And in 1962, the Indians lost, the Indian army lost dramatically in a war against China. They still remember that as a trauma. So the Indians are traumatized by the military might of China since 1962. And since then, they don't speak about it, but they remember it. The other day in Singapore at that conference, Prime Minister Modi, who is a very smart person, I don't comment his domestic policies, but internationally he's very smart. He doesn't mobilize the necessary means for his policies and strategies, but he's very smart. He avoided attack. The only thing he said about Indo-Pacific was that India had a strong friendly relationship with China, in which the two countries have developed with a lot of wisdom and sense of responsibility, etc. So he refused to say we are here within Indo-Pacific concept in order to resist to China. He did not say that. The American.
So he never said that publicly.
Oh yes, you can read. I can show you the text. Yeah, I can show you the text of your defense minister who said the opposite. It's all about against China. So this shows how delicate that is for India. But in the rhetoric, speaking about rules-based order in the region, about free and open in the Pacific, about democracy, all these things, so in the rhetoric, Prime Minister Modi was very clear. It was conceptually against China. But on the surface of the speech, nothing against China. So the Indian depend on the Chinese for many things. They depend on a peaceful relationship. They depend also now on the Chinese BRI, the road initiative, the money that the Chinese are going to put into development of infrastructure on the whole continent. They need that, but at the same time they fear China, because what China does is, because China thinks of developing and protecting trade lanes which go through the Indian Ocean, which go through Pakistan, as you can see. And what they are developing trade corridors, so to say, around China. And they build deep sea ports left of India, in Pakistan, right to east of India, in Myanmar, south, even in Sri Lanka, in the backyard of India. And there was incidentally breaking positive news for India yesterday. The Chinese ally in the Maldives has lost the elections against the Indian friend of India. So the Maldives, there's just slightly southwest from the Indian subcontinent, is a very important location strategically, because it protects or hinders the trade routes. So what the Chinese do, they encircle India with these deep sea ports. And that's what the Indians resent. Now, but it's not the end of the story. It shows how delicate the thing is for India, but the Indians have also developed their own strategy against Chinese. It's not Indo-Pacific. It's to go around Pakistan and to build a deep sea port in Iran, which is more further to the left, in order to circumvent Pakistan, and to build a railroad from Chabahar, which is the port in the south, up to Central Asia. And this again is a new connection which shows you how important for India, how important the relationship with Russia is for India. India can mobilize a strategic defense, so to say, against China by aligning itself with Russia. It's an old traditional link and friendship. So Indians rely on Russia on the western side, and on the U.S. friendship, which has offered nuclear strategic partnership, which also goes against China. But they don't want to say it's against China. It's just about the development of India under the heading of free and open Indo-Pacific.
Interesting. Do you have any comments on that?
When we put ourselves into Chinese shoes for a second, when the outside says, Imperial Overreach, you're going around us, you're going to Africa, you want to go through Central Asia into Europe, etc. Of course, it's a trite picture. I know we've heard it, we know it. The Chinese said, no, this is just the normal way we behave. We are the coming superpower. That's our right to go the way we do. So you have to find a way to bring those two things together, always provided that we want and we calculate with a peaceful outcome in the greater Asia Pacific, which is not a foregone conclusion, but that's another story. So what has changed in the last couple of years is clearly the personality of the Chinese president. He is perceived as somebody who develops these whole Chinese, if you want so, even maybe not justified, but understandable Chinese conceptions of, hey, we're a big power now. We're retaking our position that we had all the time. Now with the new president of China, of mainland China, this has become somewhat menacing, because there's now an imperial ambition there and a personal ambition there. I'll give you the Chinese dream, and the Chinese dream does not stop at the Chinese border. It goes beyond. That's why we teach the theory of the president in all universities, etc. That is new, and that is probably at the very root of all what we're talking about, the Indo-Pacific and the reaction.
Can I add just an anecdotal recollection during my time in India? I mean, all the strategic community in India, the militaries, they were speaking of the strings of pearls. This is inserted as an expression for the feeling of encirclement by China, the ports surrounding India, Pakistan, Myanmar, and Sri Lanka. And once there was a lecture or talk given by Shiv Shankar Menon. There was a great man, still a great man, was foreign secretary, was national security advisor at that time. And I asked a question, but it looked like a challenge. I asked him, what about these strings of pearls? And he, in his capacity as national security advisor, I beg you, said, no, there is no such thing. There is no such thing like a string of pearls, encirclement of China. So this is very strong. This anecdote is very telling, because it shows exactly the dilemma in which India finds itself. It has a clear perception of what is threatening them, but they don't want to address it because they're interested in the development of good relations with China. So they, publicly at least, refuse to say, yeah, it's a danger. As Prime Minister Modi the other day in Singapore said, no, it's not against China. It's about free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based order, and all these things. It's all against Chinese tactics and strategies. But even the strings of pearls is an English-Indian term to express the feeling they have. We are encircled. But publicly say, no, there's no such thing like a strings of pearls.
Well, I think, actually that's a good, I know, just in the interest of time, I'm going to go to the last map. But the framing drives the perception. I think that's one of the points that I get from your anecdote. And I want to conclude with talking a little more about trade flows, because I think framing matters here a lot. So when I lived in Japan, I was somewhat involved in some of the TPP discussions in my capacity on the American Chamber of Commerce Banking and Finance Committee. And then, the U.S. abruptly pulls out, which was not a very smart decision. I'm happy to be willing to say it. But, then the question is, now if we reframe the picture, and we've got these different framings, Belt and Road Initiative one, this Indo-Pacific Quad is another, maybe the Chinese string of pearls is not there. Maybe I'll start with you, Daniel. What is your view for how this is going to play out?
Yeah, and Jeff, you're very right. You already mentioned before TPP, the TransPacific Partnership, as one of the free trade schemes that limps a little bit. It's TPP -1, but minus a big one, the United States. And there's, of course, another free trade system that is being built, Chinese-inspired. I'm not going to bore you with all these abbreviations, but there are now two competitive systems, and my guessing is they will come together. With the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, many countries in TTP have found that some of the most offensive parts of that free trade agreement has gone out. For example, what they consider too much patent protection, etc. So we could see that the somewhat less ambitious, in a Western kind of conception, a somewhat less ambitious free trade, rather large free trade area would become a fact. Now I'm speculating, of course, in bringing all the free trade agreements, all the structure for free trade agreements in the Greater Asia Pacific together, which incidentally would also, of course, be quite a boon for the Pacific. And when we talk the Pacific and the other side of the Pacific, we're talking of the Pacific Alliance, we're talking of the whole South American coast, and we're talking of Canada. So I suppose it's in the interest of most of these countries And when you look at the flows, as you said, Jeff, you can't get around the economic realities. And the economic realities are such that intra-Asia-Pacific trade, and we're not only talking trade, we all know it's added value chains, it's production chains, and so is not only expanding, it's expanding very fast.
Sarcastically, if you allow, one could make the ironic remark that when we look at this map, we see the very strong intra-Asian exchange, trade, and all the things you have so brilliantly exposed now, and the systems of free trade which will merge one day. If you take that as a fact, as a safe future, look at the contradictory absurdity that on the one hand, you have the strongest might, military might, and economic in the region, which is the United States, having a fleet ready to protect the free and open Indo-Pacific, which serves the purpose of trade, the free trade, and at the same time the power which pretends to be protecting this militarily out of the Hawaii Command, Indo-Pacific Command, withdraws out of the free trade arrangements. Isn't that ironic?
Well,
it's unbiased. It's unbiased. I'm just saying what I'm seeing.
Yeah. Well, your key word there is pretends. I like that. They pretend to maintain the alliance. And then finally, we're a little bit over time, but I did want to just make sure we mention the fact that in addition to this, you have the military component where the Japanese are having conflict with the Chinese around a set of islands. They're also happening to have conflict not quite as heated with the Koreans and with the Russians. And there does seem to be this economic shift a little bit back toward countries like India and parts of ASEAN as a counterbalance. Before we shift to questions, maybe you can give me your quick view on what are the implications there, if any.
History teaches us that trade flows does not mean eternal peace. We saw that in Europe. It's a very important element, but it's not going to prevent catastrophic development if the main actors want to really or will not cede before a real confrontation starts. Sorry, I don't want to be a doomsayer, but just by trading, you are not saying I'm not also interested strategically.
Well, the fact is that part of the trade is trading military hardware.
Right.
Yeah, well, that's a good point.
And for this, India stands out as the number one buyer of military hardware.
Isn't that fantastic, ladies and gentlemen? India, I read the figure just the other day. India is the largest single arms buyer in the world right now. Okay, they have relatively little industry themselves, that has to be added, but it has surpassed Saudi Arabia as an arms buyer. Sorry, Jim.
So no, well maybe there's more than one meaning on these arrows. It's not you have the military aspirations driving some of the trade. I didn't really think about that. It's a very good point. Actually, on that very interesting point, why don't we conclude the panel and then shift to some questions from the audience.